I'm Kate Seeley, Senior Vice President of the Middle East Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to today's talk about the future and status of the Muslim Brotherhood regionally. We're very excited to welcome three Muslim Brotherhood experts, Alison Pargeter, I'm pronouncing it right. Alison Pargeter, Hassan Manaimi, and Eric Traeger, to talk about the challenges and opportunities for the organization 1 year after the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood's sort of fall from grace in Cairo. And we'll be focusing on the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, Ennahda, and the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, and can focus on some of the other branches, such as the Libyan MB, during the Q&A. And it's really quite amazing what a difference a year makes. Just 18 months ago, it looked like the MB had emerged as sort of the dominant regional political actor, backed by money from Qatar and Turkey. In Egypt and Tunisia, electoral successes had sort of brought it to the forefront, brought it out of the cold, and placed the MB in positions of power and responsibility. In Syria, the MB was the dominant opposition force to the Assad regime during the conflict, enjoying new international clout and also financial support. But today, we can really only point to Ennahda as a relative success story within this pantheon of experiences. The Muslim Brotherhood, as we all know, in Egypt lies in tatters. The Syrian MB, and I'm very interested to see what Eric is going to say about them, seems to have completely fumbled the ball, losing momentum and popularity to the jihadi groups that are fighting so effectively on the ground in Syria. And only Ennahda has managed to sort of maintain its role as a political player, thanks partially to its pragmatism and also thanks to due to the fact that it is up against very strong Tunisian secular parties which have pushed back. So how did the Muslim Brotherhood brand, if we can call it such a thing, a brand that has been marked by its populist savvy, so bungled, if we can say that, these series of opportunities? Was it poor leadership, or is there something intrinsic to its thinking and its structure that makes it poorly prepared to handle the complexities of real leadership? What is their policy, their strategy, and their thinking going forward now in the face of these new challenges and losses? Well, thankfully, we have three individuals who've been studying the MB for quite a long time to answer these very, well, I won't call my questions important questions, but to answer these questions. Alison Pargeter is a senior researcher at the Royal United Services Institute in the UK and a senior associate at the global consulting firm Minas Associates, where she specializes in political Islamist movements. She's written several books on Islamists, including this one, The Muslim Brotherhood, From Opposition to Power by Saki Press, as well as The New Frontiers of Jihad, Radical Islam in Europe, among her other works. Hassan Manaimi, to her right, is a senior transatlantic fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where he studies socio-political and cultural developments in the Islamic world. He had been acting director of GMF's Tunis office before it was closed, and of the Tunis-based MENA Partnership for Democracy and Development. He's also a regular contributor to the pan-Arab newspaper El Hayat. And Eric Traeger is the Esther K. Wagner Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he specializes in Egyptian politics and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. However, recently he's been doing a lot of research on the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood and is going to share with us his insights. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Affairs, to name a few. I want to thank you all for joining us. It's a real honor and a privilege. We're going to start with, oh, and thank you, Alison, for joining us from the UK. She's based in London. We're going to start with Alison and the Egyptian MB, and then Eric's going to weigh in on the Syrian MB, and Hassan will wrap up with Ennahda and some of his other thoughts. So, Alison, tfaddali.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to be here. So, as Kate said, 1 year on from President Morsi's ousting, it's clear that the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is shattered and still in shock. The majority of its leadership are in prison or exile, its networks and finances are destroyed, and it's still really, I think, trying to itself digest what happened. And as such, it's actually very difficult to assess both its current status and its future strategy, and I think it's still very much trying to determine that itself. But the future of the Egyptian Brotherhood is critical, not just for the Brotherhood, the Egyptian Brotherhood, or for the Brotherhood as an international movement, but really for the whole of reformist-style political Islam that appears at the moment to be being eclipsed by the more militant currents such as ISIS in Iraq and Syria, or by militant groups in Libya or elsewhere. So how the Egyptian Brotherhood decides to internalize its experience and what future path it's going to take is going to be important for the region and beyond. As of yet, however, I think the Egyptian Brotherhood's main preoccupation is with its own survival, and it's really acting just as one would expect any movement to do in such circumstances. It's acting defensively, it's trying to shift the blame away from itself, and it's employing the discourse that it's the victim of some grand conspiracy, and that internal and external forces came together to ensure it couldn't rule. Now, I would say that such assertions are not entirely unfounded. I'm not going to buy into the idea that there was some big conspiracy against the Brotherhood, but they were certainly up against a state machinery that never really gave them free rein to operate and that tried to act as a spoiler at almost every turn. However, it seems that the Brotherhood at the moment has amplified this discourse and has notched it up to a near metaphysical level. And the brothers are talking as though what they experienced was somehow divinely ordained and part of a bigger test that they have to undergo. And in fact, there's nothing new here. They've always looked at periods of suffering in this way. Mahmoud Hussein, the General Secretary, said in 2012, Allah wanted what was inflicted upon us. And this idea is repeated again and again. And this is clearly a discourse of self-preservation. It's an attempt to maintain cohesion and the loyalty of their supporters and to deflect blame. Now, alongside this discourse, their strategy is to keep on protesting, believing, I think, that if they sit it out for long enough, things will turn back in their favour. Or in their own words, they've determined to take the path of steadfastness and defending legitimacy with a long breath. And from speaking to many members of the Brotherhood, it seems that they've really convinced themselves that it's only a matter of time before the tide turns and the people will sweep Sisi aside and demand a return to legitimacy. But 1 year on, it seems that they're really struggling to maintain the momentum and the strategy isn't working. Despite the almost daily photos posted on Facebook and Twitter, and despite reports on Al Jazeera on an almost daily basis of new demonstrations, actually in the face of such severe and brutal repression, the protests and demos seem to be dwindling. And what were big demos are now taking the form more of flash mobs that are no more than minor irritants to the state. And it feels as though Egypt, or at least the political equation in Egypt, has moved on. And I think the international community has also moved on, and the new status quo in Egypt has installed itself and become a political reality. And the Brotherhood's dream that the people would rise up and the international community would back them in the name of legitimacy has failed. And even the Brotherhood's own expressed fear that their youth might become so hot-headed that they wouldn't be able to contain them, and that they would commit acts of violence hasn't materialized either. But it seems that the Brotherhood really don't have any alternative strategy. And in fact, the disarray is such that these protests seem to be their only real capital at the moment and the only way of showing that they're not a spent force. And as such, they've been left with no choice but just to keep things going, to give the impression that the fight is still going on. And in this context, they're talking as though the demos are growing by the week, that they're being joined by other forces. They're saying now that some of the Egyptians who supported the move to get rid of Morsi have now realized the error of their ways and are about to join them. And it seems that they're a movement desperately trying to reach out to other forces to bring them in. But so far, these forces, who are clearly still smarting from their experience during the Brotherhood's time in power, don't seem to want to play ball. And in fact, the opposite seems to be happening. Even some of their Islamist allies look to be turning their back on them. Abu Zumar of Al-Jamaat al-Islamiyya a couple of days ago called on the Muslim Brotherhood to come back and contest the next elections and to do a political review, something that upset the Brotherhood. And it seems really that the Brotherhood are looking more isolated than ever. And I think all of this reflects an acute desperation from a movement that's trying to shield itself and its supporters from the fact that it lost the biggest prize in its long history, and that has almost no other options on the table. So what other options do they have? Well, some have suggested that the movement might turn its back on politics and go down the path of violence. I think this is extremely unlikely. The Brotherhood knows that doing so would be the end of the end. They would lose any popular support that they have, they would lose the moral high ground, and it would justify even greater repression at the hands of the regime that would close the tiny little space that it's left for them at the moment. Also, although some Muslim Brotherhood branches and individuals have been involved in violence in the past, its sort of pacific nature has become so much of the narrative about its own identity that I think it's difficult to imagine the movement taking going down such a route. As to reconciliation, clearly the Brotherhood isn't ready for reconciliation at the moment, or at least any reconciliation that doesn't involve President Morsi being reinstated. And the latest response to Amr Musa's initiative, who's trying to reach out to them, was to say, go and talk to the president in prison. This position is understandable. The Brotherhood know that Sisi is strong at the moment, and any reconciliation will see them making huge concessions. But it seems to me that they've trapped themselves in this idea that the only way to come to negotiation and to reconciliation is through Morsi, as if he has become the key to everything. And it seems they can't move forward without it. So the Brotherhood seem to be stuck in this impossible conundrum with no real strategy. But if they don't pull themselves out of this, they risk condemning themselves to, at best, always being an opposition force, and probably a semi-clandestine one as before. I think it's likely we'll see them try to rebuild their networks. They've certainly done that before, such as following the major crackdown in the 1960s. But this way, I think they're only going to imprison themselves with their own base. And it seems that the only way to stand a chance of actually going beyond this base and to win back the trust of those Egyptians who voted for them because of out of the benefit of the doubt is to somehow reinvent themselves and to engage in some meaningful reform. Now, it's clearly way too early for the Brotherhood to start such a process at the moment. Things are too raw, the key figures are still in prison, and one needs to feel safe and secure to be able to start such a process. As to whether they might engage in such a process further down the line, well, I think that's also questionable. For all its talk of being a reformist movement, the one thing that the Brotherhood has never been able to do is to reform itself. And there are many reasons for this. Firstly, they're a product of their own society. They're part of the same authoritarian political culture as the regime. And they're part of a landscape that's not really prone to self-review or to real reform. Also, they're more than just a political movement. They're a socio-religious movement that prioritizes close ties and loyalty, and a movement carrying a huge tradition that dates back decades. And as one Egyptian analyst recently noted, I think rightly, you can criticize your political party, but it's impossible to look back at the history of your family and religion critically. Added to that, the Brotherhood is a huge, unwieldy movement, comprising so many different strands and orientations. And the late Egyptian researcher Hossam Tamam once described it as a large, lumbering elephant, making it very difficult to reform. And we shouldn't forget that the Brotherhood is also a movement that's really struggled to clearly articulate its own ideology, to articulate an ideology that goes beyond generalities. This was true when they were in opposition, when they came up with a series of political platforms in the 2000s that failed to really clarify their stance on key issues such as democracy, Sharia. And it's also true when they were in power. And I think many were left, after their experience in power, perplexed at what the Brotherhood's vision or ideology actually was. So real reform is going to mean pinning down exactly what they stand for and instituting a new kind of culture within the movement, something that risks fracturing it and weakening it. And also, I would say that the Brotherhood still have some capital in the fact that they have the support of Qatar and Turkey that have become a kind of lifeline of legitimacy and support. And I think all of these factors mitigate against serious internal reform. Now, that, of course, doesn't mean that the Brotherhood are going to go away, especially since the structural conditions in Egypt that spawned the movement in the first place haven't fundamentally changed, and they're always going to have a core support base. But if they can't reform themselves to turn themselves into a truly national force, then I think their political future is always going to be limited. However, the Brotherhood's future success will depend not just on the Brotherhood, but on the future of Egypt itself. And if Egypt can somehow cut off with its authoritarian politics that are grounded in the past and really move on and institute some proper institutional reform and a change of political culture, then the country might have the chance to move both beyond the regime and beyond the Brotherhood, and a new alternative might emerge. If it can't, then I think we're going to see Egypt will remain politically stagnant and caught between these two same old forces, the military and political Islam as articulated by the Brotherhood, and really both need to change if Egypt is to have any chance of moving forwards. And I just finished with a comment about the Brotherhood that was made to me recently by Dr. Mohammed Habib, who was the former Deputy General Guide who just left the movement. And he said, "The future of the organisation is dark, and changing its image will require huge efforts and time, and may go beyond a decade." Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So the Egyptian MB is stuck with no strategy. Eric, tell us about the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's great to see some friends in the audience. You know, this is something I never thought I'd be able to say, but I think the Mets will have a better year than the Muslim Brotherhood. All right, on to the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. So just a brief on how I conducted this research. Last summer, I was in Turkey for roughly 3 weeks. I got to interview 5 very top leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, a number of mid-level leaders, and a number of their youth. So what I'm going to present today is largely their organizational details, and I'm going to explain how their organization relates to their function and their capabilities. One of the aspects of the Brotherhood that I believe has been significantly overlooked in our policy debate about the Brotherhood is the way in which they're structured, is the way in which they make decisions, and actually how fundamental that is to their ideology. So let me just kind of give you a quick overview of the organization. It was founded in 1946 by Mustafa al-Sabah. He had gone to study in Egypt in the 1930s, befriended Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Brotherhood, I'll speak about in a moment, was arrested twice in participating in Brotherhood rallies in Egypt against the British, returned to Syria in roughly 1941 or 1942, and founded the Brotherhood in 1946. Now, the Syrian Brotherhood was actually extremely politically active, informal politics during the early years of its founding. It won parliamentary seats in the elections from 46 to 61. It had ministers. In 1962, its second leader, Issam al-Attar, was even offered the premiership. He declined it. He refused to participate in a coup that year. Of course, in 1963, you had the Ba'athist coup. The Ba'ath Party outlawed the Brotherhood. Their leadership went into exile. And this is sort of where the conditions in which the Brotherhood would exist for roughly the next 50 years start to emerge. You have this leadership that is in exile, and still until the early 1980s, the cadres on the ground, and this created certain divisions. One of those divisions was known as the Fighting Vanguard. These were Muslim brothers who, you know, it's controversial whether they were actually still Muslim brothers or broke away. That's actually a matter of debate, but they started an armed insurgency against the regime starting in the mid-60s, really escalating in the 1970s. In 1980, the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, passed Law 49, which made membership in the Syrian Brotherhood punishable by death. This will be important for a point that I'm going to raise later about their recruitment in exile. And then, of course, in 1982, you had the failed Nafir, the failed uprising in Hama, which ended in a terrible massacre, somewhere between 10 and 40,000 people killed. And then the Brotherhood, from that point on, went into exile. Those were in the country. Many of them were put to death, many imprisoned for decades, some released in the late 90s. But really, as an organization, the Syrian Brotherhood continued to exist in exile. Before I explain the impact of exile on the Brotherhood, on its capabilities, and on its nature, I think it's really important to kind of understand what this organization is about. So, as you know, as many of you know, the Muslim Brotherhood was founded in Egypt in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna, and Hassan al-Banna emerged in this sort of intellectual milieu in which people were asking themselves, Muslims were asking themselves, Muslim thinkers were asking themselves the following question: why is it that Islam has fallen behind the West? Why is it that Islam, which was on the cutting edge of science and technology, which dominated much of the known world during the early centuries of its founding, why is it that Islam is now dominated both culturally and politically by the West, politically, of course, through imperialism? And a certain group of Islamic scholars, who we now refer to as modernists, said that in order to resist Western cultural and political influences, you needed to revive Islam. You need to revive Islam by modernizing it, by taking those things that worked in the West and using it to advance Islam. A great example would be elections. Elections is an administrative tactic really developed in the West that could be used to advance Islam, but it should be used to advance Islamist parties. And again, at the center of this idea is the whole point of reviving Islam is to resist Western cultural and political influence. Now, what Hassan al-Banna added to this way of thinking was an organization that he believed could accomplish that, an organizational model that he believed, and frankly Muslim Muslim Brothers still speak as this as their goal, is Islamizing the individual, building an organization that could build what were, in his view, good and active Muslims, so they could then spread in the society to Islamize the society, then Islamize the state, gain power, and then build a series of countries dominated by these kinds of organizations for what they call a global Islamic state. So this is a long-term process trying to build a social/political movement to resist the West. The key problem here is that, you know, their idea of Sharia was incredibly non-specific. I mean, this is not a very intellectual movement. This doesn't have an usul al-fiqh. This doesn't appeal to any real school. Implementing the Sharia in the Brotherhood's way of speech is really about gaining power. It's about justifying what they are doing at the local, social, and political, and then regional level as being consistent with Sharia, but with actually no real textual reference. And now, one of the key splits, getting back to the Syrian Brotherhood that started emerging in the late 70s, was between the Aleppo branch that focused on da'wah. This is actually a very important point that Allison hits on in her book, which I would urge you all to read, between the da'wah kind of wing of the Aleppans, and by the way, these geographical categories are very loose. So the Aleppo faction wanted to focus on outreach, wanted to focus on building the organization, gaining new members, and growing it, whereas the Hama faction wanted to focus on resisting the regime, on jihad, and on politics. That basic division we frankly see in the Egyptian Brotherhood as well, between the kind of Abdul Monem Abdul Futu types known as Dawa Wala Kuda, who focus on outreach, working with others, long-term Islamization, versus your Morsis or your Shatters, who are focused on politics and gaining power now. My point in emphasizing this division between Dawa, outreach-type brothers on one hand, and jihad, politics-type or resistance brothers on the other, is that it's a difference in tactics. It's actually not in any way a difference in ideology. It's not that one is moderate and one is conservative. It's that their approach towards achieving the exact same end, political power to resist the West, is the same. All right, how does the Syrian Brotherhood try to build this kind of organization that can take over the society, the state, and then through other organizations, the region, through a 9 to 11 year tarbiyah process? Now, you know, Syrian Muslim brothers in Syria historically were recruited from mosques or universities. After 1 year trial period known as the Nasir, they would take an oath to the organization, and then they would be promoted through 2 additional tiers of membership, which each had a more intensive curriculum than the one that preceded it, tested, vetted for their commitment to the organization. This is a vanguard. This is trying to make sure that there is some level of ideological unity and unity of purpose that will respond to a chain of command that I'm going to lay out in the next slide. You know, the problem is, in exile, this became very hard to uphold for 2 reasons. First of all, in exile, recruitment changed. Remember when I mentioned that the Syrian regime in 1980 passed law number 49, making it punishable by death to be a Syrian Muslim brother? The Syrian Brotherhood took the decision that it would not recruit from non-Brotherhood families, because it was afraid that if it recruited some Syrian guy not connected to the Brotherhood already, he or his family would be liable for punishment back in Syria. So it narrowed its recruitment base, for the most part, down to the children of members who are in exile. That is, by the way, a huge long-term problem for the Muslim Brotherhood looking 30 years later. The second thing is, this is a very rigorous process. Who's really going to want to join this in exile when there might be other opportunities? So they kind of watered it down. Now, I found some differences in the way this may have been done for Syrian Muslim brothers in Iraq versus Syrian Muslim brothers in Jordan, but the point is, this became an organization in exile that was trying to just maintain itself, and that meant watering down certain aspects of its tarbiyah process, of its indoctrination process. Note, the oath is optional in the exiled tarbiyah process. Very similar, by the way, to the tarbiyah process in the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, which is a 5 to 8 year process. I could discuss that more in the Q&A. So what did the Syrian Brotherhood in Syria do with these people that they'd watched for 9 to 11 years and indoctrinated for all this time? They inserted them in a top-down chain of command. The lowest level was known as the Usra. These were cells of roughly 5 to 10 people who met weekly for about 2 to 3 hours. This is where the local activities of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood would take place, whether they were preaching activities, recruitment activities, charity drives, politics, organizing local campaigns, all there. The rest of this is very administrative, so a few families makes up what's called a committee. Then you have the province-level leadership, which in Syria was according to what province you were in, according to Syrian provinces. But in exile, your country became your province. So there was the Iraqi leadership, there was the Jordanian leadership. There are actually 3 provinces, according to this structure, in Saudi Arabia, because so many Syrian Muslim Brotherhoods fled to Saudi Arabia. Europe had a province, etc. And then this all answers, in theory, to the leadership, the Qiyada, and that has 2 components, one of which is the Shura Committee, the legislature that basically makes the key decisions that the Qiyada executes. And then finally, you have the circles. These are sort of thematic files within the leadership. So you have one circle that focuses on politics and media, one that focuses on internal administration, one that focuses on the revolution, that's, you know, arming of groups, sending in supplies, those sorts of things. National work manages the relationships among different opposition movements, and the future circle focuses on the Syrian Brotherhood's political party, which was recently announced a few months ago, Al-Wad, meaning the promise. It's an attempt to, you know, create a broad-based party, but again, under the Brotherhood structure. That's just kind of an arrow showing how a chain of command works. Just to show you that this is not in any way unique to the Syrian Brotherhood, you can see the Egyptian Brotherhood has the exact same model. These 2 components, a long recruitment and indoctrination process in which members are vetted, then this kind of pyramidal chain of command, is what defines the Muslim Brotherhood. I can tell you in Egypt, these are not just bureaucratic details. These are actually essential components of what it means to be and work in the Brotherhood. All right, let me touch on, finally, the consequences of exile, and here's where I'm going to close. Being in exile meant, like I said, that the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood had to focus, first and foremost, on organizational maintenance. It had to make sure that it survived. It had maybe thousands of people in exile, so one of the things that it did was it managed to fund their livelihoods, fund their housing, fund their education. This became, in exile, actually a very wealthy organization, both because it had very wealthy members, doctors, engineers, builders, but also donors who are, frankly, it's very hard to get a handle on who the donors were. But anyway, this was a wealthy organization, but it was weak on the ground. It maintained very little contact with the ground through chains of communication that took months to really work out. In other words, in passing messages. And you've seen that weakness on the ground, and it's become the key liability for the Syrian Brotherhood during the uprising, where while the Syrian Brotherhood, because it had developed great relationships with the regimes that housed it in exile, it was a very capable political player, it was a very capable diplomatic player, but it really didn't have anything on the ground. So what it initially tried to do was fund different brigades and then bring those brigades under its chain of command, or at least make it responsive to its chain of command. That failed because many of the brigades said, look, we're the ones fighting, we're the ones dying. So then the Syrian Brotherhood started participating in the creation of al-Durua, meaning the shields, individual brigades which frankly don't have a national strategy, but in some way or another are connected and not always very coherently to the Brotherhood. But these have not been very pivotal fighting forces in Syria. Now, just a final point on this, you know, the fact that the Brotherhood had failed in its uprising in 1982, was therefore seen as a terrorist organization in Syria, made it hesitant to even take this step because it didn't want to remind people of 1982, but as the fighting escalated, it made this decision. But like I said, at the same time, they were capable diplomatic players. They had worked in international politics for many years. They had had good relations with the regimes that housed them, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all of over the world, and this allowed them to really move towards the fore very, very quickly in the early months and year of the uprising, building the SNC, dominating the SNC, but at the same time that alienated much of the opposition, which came to view the Brotherhood with good reason as just power hungry and controlling. The other downside to being capable diplomatic players was that when the diplomatic winds shifted, especially after last year's coup in Egypt, this became a real problem for the Syrian Brotherhood, because suddenly Saudi Arabia, which wasn't so hot on the Brotherhood anyway, started actively working against them. The Syrian Brotherhood tried to overcome this by backing, or at least the deputy of the Syrian Brotherhood, Taifour, backed the election of Jarba to be president of the opposition, but this this didn't work out, and that's a big factor in the Syrian Brotherhood's decline. And finally, my final point here is, the Syrian Brotherhood, and I want to emphasize this again, has significant long-term challenges. This is an organization that has not really been using its chain of command over the last 32 years for politics. It's been using it for maintenance. It's been using it to transmit funds for funding its people's livelihood in exile. It's been, yes, keeping its ideology pretty constant, but it's been focused in recruitment only on the children of Syrian Brotherhood leaders. So there is a very narrow base among its youth, and frankly, it's having a very difficult time transitioning into the politics. It's not as adept as the Egyptian Brotherhood, which of course spent years using that chain of command specifically for elections, for politics, and for growing the organization under freer conditions. But the fact that they are weak does not mean that we should count them out. We should remember that one of the key lessons of the Arab Spring is that in disorganized societies, even relatively well-organized groups tend to emerge, tend to do very well. The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood did not in any sense have majority support, but it was an extremely well-organized group, maybe 500,000 people in a country of 86 million, and that enabled it to win power. I'm not saying that the Syrian Brotherhood is on the cusp of power should Assad fall, but I'm saying that because it's the most organized and best funded opposition player, even despite its internal challenges, we shouldn't count it out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. So the Syrian MB, capable diplomatically, weak on the ground. Hassan, your view of Ennahda these days?
Sure, I'm sure I'll get to Ennahda, but let me point to the following. You've so far had, sorry, two speakers with two different approaches, and here's the third with a totally different approach. What we had at first was a very empirical, very political focused, very, I would say, I'm sorry? I'm saying that the first presentation was very empirical, very political in focus. The second was structural and more theoretical. And I'm going to give you something even more, if you'd like, general in order to zoom in into Ennahda. But prior to doing that, let me just make two quick comments on the presentation that Eric has just done. Those of you who have any knowledge of Leninism, Stalinism should have had quite a bit of deja vu happening, and this is no coincidence. The Muslim Brotherhood, as well as Islamism in general, is very much so a product of the 20th century and product of the impulses of the 20th century, including the whole notion of the new man that is built along lines that Eric alluded to. But if he would allow me, I'd like to expand on them, because I would like to contrast that with what we see in the context of Ennahda when I get to Ennahda. The idea is that, as Eric mentioned, to Islamize the individual in order to Islamize the family, in order to Islamize society, then government, then the state, then to create a number of Islamic states all over the globe in order to get to what the Muslim Brotherhood referred to as Ustadiyya. This is an important concept because I'd like you to focus on it, meaning I'd like to explain it a little bit, because I'd like to contrast it with two other concepts that are currently in circulation in that wide area that is Islamism. One is Khilafah, given caliphate, caliphate, given that caliphate has been declared, the Muslim Brotherhood may have had, as in terms of its rhetoric, some hints and some at times not so subtle hints of an attempt at a restoration of the time that was. But in its slim attempts at creating an ideology, it was not Khilafah but Ustadiyya that it has sought. What is Ustadiyya? It's mentorship, it's primacy, it is role modeling in a certain sense. The Muslim Brotherhood, without fleshing its ideology, thought that this progression from the ground up, which I'm suggesting to you, if you compare it to communism, you will see a lot of similarities. What we have is an emergence of, if you like, of a global model that would take primacy, that would take precedence. This has remained to an unequaled extent purely in the books, along the lines that on the ground, as actually in both presentations before has been underlined, really the driving element of any transaction with the individual, with society, is power, is gaining power. It is not about Islamizing, it's not about, and for that matter, just from the point of view of a Muslim society, just imagine how offensive it is to tell a Muslim or a Muslim society our purpose is to Islamize you. What are we, chopped liver here? Meaning there's a dissonance, even at that level there's a dissonance, meaning when you call on Islamizing someone who feels and really lives as a Muslim, among other things. In any case, what matters here is that we have to place the Muslim Brotherhood in its emergence in the context of those grand narratives that are part of that, again, Eric alluded to, this is my second reference to Eric's comments, that huge bifurcation in terms of modern Middle Eastern thought towards reform. Indeed, in the 19th century, a lot of, through new exposure with this word system that is based in Europe, there had been a lot of thinking about what modernity and progress are. The most telling quotation that I'd like to keep in mind is the quotation attributed to a cleric. Sometimes it's Tatawi, sometimes it's Abdu, sometimes it's neither. I'm not sure. It might be apocryphal, but it's relevant nonetheless. This cleric, having been to Paris and coming back to Cairo and saying, I saw Islam without Muslims, I look here and I see nothing but Muslims without Islam. So the equation in his mind, Islam equals progress, Islam equals justice. It's not the rituals that he saw in Cairo. Again, there are various versions of this apocryphal story. It may be or may not be, but what's relevant in it is the whole notion that there was a drive towards modernity that sought to strip away the accumulated burdens on Islamic thought in order to go back to what was believed to be this quintessential essence, this essence of Islam, which is progress, which is forward-looking. So we have Muhammad Abdu, who was a disciple of Afghani. Again, for those of you who know, you will understand why the succession matters. For those of you who do not, really don't bother with it, but I'll state it nonetheless. From Afghani, we have Abdu. From Abdu, we have Muhammad Rashid Rida, who's more conservative. From Muhammad Rashid Rida, we have Hassan al-Banna, who's slightly more conservative. From Hassan al-Banna, we have Sayyid Qutb. From Sayyid Qutb, we have Abdullah Azzam. From Abdullah Azzam, we have Osama bin Laden. Look, I went from Abdu, the reformist, to Osama bin Laden. But another track can also be established. From Muhammad Abdu all the way to Hatta Hussein, who basically stated the problem with Egypt is that Islam as a state religion hampers progress, hampers education, hampers moving forward. And therefore, we have had a bifurcation. Nonetheless, what matters in it is that that bifurcation came in the context of experimentations with grand narratives. First, an elite liberalism that promised universalism and modernity and failed. Then, a nativistic nationalism that promised liberation and independence and failed. And then a universalist internationalism, socialist internationalism, that promised worldwide revolution and failed. And then again, like a pendulum swing, we go back to nativism in the form of an Islamism that promises authenticity and progress and failed. Okay, I'm actually maybe getting ahead of myself here to declare it failed, but actually they have to a large extent declared it failed, meaning the Islamists, because they have split into different models. We have currently 3 models of Islamism in competition. One that would like to have a caliphate, one would like to have a primacy, and the third one, this is where An-Nahda comes, and this is how I'm getting to An-Nahda, that would like to have consensus. or at least dialogue, or at least democracy in its procedural recognition of the diversity of society. I'm not here going to fetishize An-Nahda by telling you that An-Nahda has achieved that, because An-Nahda is barely starting. Actually, this is something not unique to Islamists in the region. Across the Middle East, from Iraq, Kuwait, all the way to Morocco, and from Yemen all the way to Syria, you have a lot of sloganeering. You have a lot of declarations of ideological stance, such as one of the more famous ones lately, Islam is the solution. Try to parse it, try to get into it, try to dig into it, there's very little. That does not only apply to Islamists. If you look at liberals in the region, or socialists in the region, or communists in the region, there's very little theory, there's a lot of sloganeering engaged. And in this context, again, we do not need to dismiss the sloganeering as irrelevant. It is very much so relevant because it sets the course, it sets the tone, but it basically underlines the fact that once you are tested, when you are subjected to an actual experimentation that needs to prove how true you are to the slogan, you might discover that the slogan is not suitable, and therefore abandon it, or therefore sideline it, etc. And to a large extent, this is an argument that can be made with regard to the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood did announce, despite the fact, again, as Eric has mentioned, and I'm sure you'll find lots of references to that, there were a lot of offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood that took on arms and took on militancy as their modus operandi. But the Muslim Brotherhood itself preserved the notion that we are to get it through the affinity we have with our societies. We do not need the weaponry. We can do it by the very simple fact that the population is responsive to us. The population is like us. It's not like the elites that rule it. This was the conviction. Now, the fact of the matter, meaning, as I need to underline here, when we look at the Muslim Brotherhood and we would like to judge them on their peaceful ideology, it's important to underline a peaceful ideology that graduates that many violent and militant activists has to review itself. Because meaning the idea is that if you're so peaceful, how come every single radical movement, every single militant movement in the region starts with the Muslim Brotherhood and then graduates? Graduates or it drops out, depending on your view. But it's important here to underline, therefore, that we have the Muslim Brotherhood proposing a model. We have radical Islamism, jihadism, Salafism. These are not the same, but let's not get into the details. Proposing alternative models, with the most extreme today being the one that ISIS has not only proposed, but pretends to have implemented in the form of a caliphate on the ground. And we have, at the other end of the spectrum, we have An-Nahda, which actually, if you read As-Sabah is the main Tunisian newspaper this morning, you will notice two almost contradictory, As-Sabah is not friendly to An-Nahda, but you will notice two contradictory pieces of news. One that says An-Nahda is comfortable in the fact that polls suggest that An-Nahda may win a flat-out majority in Tunisia. This is item of news number one. And that Sabah is actually calling it a danger because it's the low voter registration that might yield that result. And the other piece of news on An-Nahda today is that An-Nahda is calling for a consensus on the next president of Tunisia. And As-Sabah is calling it an attempt to sabotage democracy because they do not want to go to the democratic process. So which is it? Meaning, again, but if this underlines two facts. If An-Nahda is experimenting with democratic practice, so are the liberals and the seculars and the Democrats, between quotation marks, everywhere in the region. So it's important to underline that we're not talking here about one party at the exclusion of the others. Nonetheless, so An-Nahda today is about the notion that really this is, I'm summarizing to you a conversation, although in my own words, that I had with An-Nahda leadership, that it goes along those lines. We do realize that Western democracy today adheres to a set of universal values that include justice, equality, representation, etc. But the West got to those notions through a whole history that stems from dogma to natural law to the friction between state and religion to the establishment of universal values in those terms. We innately know that we share those universal values, but let us get to them along the path that is suitable to our own cultural experience. There is strength and weakness in such a statement. The strength is, yes, if indeed such an effort at creating or at deriving universal values from a particular cultural experience is successful, there's more acceptance and less challenges on the part of importation or imposition of outside ideas. But very often, such an exercise is used in order to camouflage something else, which is allow us, through relativism, the right not to apply universal values. And therefore, it is indeed, meaning that the need to challenge An-Nahda at every step of the way is important, but it's also important to recognize that in the case of An-Nahda, we have an experimentation in trying to accept the notion of popular will, the non-paternalism of the state, citizen empowerment, as notions that are integral to an ideology that views itself as being derived from an Islamic referential framework. This is the main issue. This is why An-Nahda, and for that matter, even the Muslim Brotherhood, are declared to be heretics by ISIS and many others. So along this spectrum, this is where An-Nahda stands. But it's also interesting to underline another item, and this would be the last for the time being, which is the whole notion that beyond ideology, we have a current across An-Nahda, across many of the Muslim Brotherhood movements, all the way actually to Turkey and the AKP, a movement that transcends ideology, that transcends religion. What I'm talking about is the following. There's the notion of an us versus them, not on the basis of ideology, but on the basis of belonging. The idea, keep in mind that I've described the Muslim Brotherhood before as having tribal allegiances. The allegiance to the Muslim Brotherhood is not always an ideological one. Actually, I would argue it's more often of a tribal nature, meaning it's our faction versus the other faction. The other faction can be XYZ depending on the setting. But the argument here that across these many societies, there's the notions that the Muslim peoples, in the plural, are subjected to some unfair situation, and therefore there's the need to stand together as Muslim peoples, not necessarily on the basis of Muslim ideology as much as on the basis of Muslim solidarity. You see, and this to a large extent, the AKP tries to, Davutoglu in the AKP in particular, tries to underline the whole notion of Turkey's leadership in the Islamic world is based not that much on ideology as much on the shared culture and history and religion, but as opposed to ideology. And An-Nahda to a large extent also try to underline that. So it is trying in that sense, if we start with that the main characteristics of political discourse in the region being paternalism, elitism, and tribalism, and really paternalism in the sense that the state is father, the state is mother, and the citizens are children that needs to be punished and rewarded, etc. Elitism in the sense that the vanguard, as actually noted, the vanguard knows best. Okay, you as the general population do not know much. And tribalism, it's the us versus them. An-Nahda is making some inroads here and there, at least in theory, to break these three elements of sclerosis in the political setting. But again, it needs not only to be watched and watched intensely, but it also needs to be encouraged and pushed in the direction, because while we can trust the intentions of many in the leadership, we cannot trust what the temptation of power that has dictated so much in the past will do to that leadership. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I want to thank all three of our panelists for their wide-ranging analysis and assessment of these three branches of the Brotherhood. And because all three of you have studied the other branches quite a bit, I'd kind of like you to pick up perhaps on what some of the others said and get your input. I know, Alison, you've been studying the Syrian MB, and I'd be curious to know in a minute or so kind of what your assessment is of where they stand today. Hassan, do you agree with Alison's view that the MB in Egypt is stuck with no strategy? And if so, how might they emerge from this quagmire they're in? And Eric, how do you view An-Nahda and this notion that they are more pragmatic and they're consensus builders and they're committed to that? So if I could just bring you all into some analysis of the other branches, and then we'll open the floor. Alison, please.
Well, I'm actually not going to talk about the Syrian Brotherhood because I've looked at it in the past, but it's not an area that I've been focusing. And I think Eric sort of did a great job of looking at where it is today. And for me, the branch of the Brotherhood that's quite interesting at the moment that nobody seems to be looking at is actually the Libyan Brotherhood. Now, I know they're not hugely important insofar as the whole political scene in Libya is not where the real sort of centre of power lies. But over the last couple of years, they have become a major political force, and they've shaped the political environment. And whereas we've seen in Tunisia and taking on board the lessons of the Egyptian experience, sort of modifying their discourse, working in a more consensual way as a result of what happened in Egypt. In fact, we've seen the Libyans do the complete opposite. After President Morsi was toppled, the initial response of the Libyan Brotherhood was they said they were going to freeze their political activities and people were attacking their offices in Libya, and they sort of pulled back a bit. Since then, however, all those lessons seem to have been forgotten. They're working in a sort of the complete antithetical way of being consensus. They're working with other Islamist allies to really force some of the liberal and secular parties out of power. They've been sort of pushing very hard to try and push the political exclusion law, to push anyone linked to the former regime from having a role within the Libyan state. And they've also been siding with sort of militias on the ground above the state armed forces. So what for me is really interesting, that one assumes that the Egyptian experience would teach a lesson to all these other branches. This isn't the case. When the situation and the circumstances on the ground permit, we can see the Brotherhood sort of carrying on in their own sort of way. And it hasn't had the same effect, which I think sort of highlighting just how differently all these branches operate.
And hence the military reaction to the MB's power grab. I mean, there's quite a bit of fighting now in Libya over this issue.
Absolutely, yeah. And the Brotherhood aligning themselves up with forces on the ground, even sort of apologising for Ansar al-Sharia and putting themselves in that same camp in a bid to keep secular forces out of the arena. And we've seen them particularly hawkish.
So no lessons learned in Libya?
Absolutely not.
Thank you, Elton. Hassan?
Actually, two things. First, with regard to the Tunisians learning from the Egyptian experience, let's underline the fact that the Tunisians tried to avoid the Egyptian experience. Actually, the leadership of Al-Nahda was in Cairo trying to convince the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood to seek compromise and not to engage in what amounted to the suicidal act of confrontation with the military. So yes, this is informed by, if you like, some fear on the part of the Tunisian Al-Nahda about the establishment and the military reacting harshly to any appearance of power that they might have and putting them back in jail. But also it stemmed from the notion that a recognition of the fact that these societies can no longer be considered to be monochromatic, and therefore there needs to be an acceptance of diversity and pluralism, which clearly the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, if it antagonized the Egyptian population, is because it thought that the very thin electoral victory that it achieved was a mandate to own Egypt. And clearly the Egyptians disagreed, and the military disagreed, and the military took advantage of that major mistake that the Muslim Brotherhood engaged in. As to the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, I would say the following. Clearly, in a country devastated by the corrosive regime of the Assads, which effectively today has only a chance of survival if it ensures more and more destruction happens, not just in terms of infrastructure and underground, but also in terms of the fabric of the state and society and anything in Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood, being in exile, have a slight advantage, but I would call it a very minimal and probably irrelevant advantage, because what I see in Syria is nothing but diving deeper and deeper into an abyss that, I'm sorry to say, there is no end to, according to the way the elements are set today, and therefore they can engage in some, I'm talking about the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, they can engage in some theoretical musings about what could be, what could have been, etc. And actually they were driven into, and this is not surprising to me at all, to engage more and more into discussions about the caliphate and whether the caliphate is necessary, is obligatory. They were sidelined because of the lack of ideological substance that they have, and because of events on the ground and their irrelevance in terms of what happens on the ground. They were really sidelined into actually arguing with ISIS, you see, about the caliphate. So I would say the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood is irrelevant. The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood had made itself irrelevant, and it has a chance and it has an obligation actually to become relevant once again, because it does represent a large segment of the Egyptian population that no declaration of the organization being terrorist or being coup inclined or whatever else fiction on the part of the current regime in Egypt can cancel. I mean, this is a reality. But I'm not hopeful in the case of Egypt that it's going to be a quick recovery in that sense.
Comment also on Egypt.
Yeah, sure. I haven't looked very closely at Tunisia, so what they said sounded very good to me. On Egypt, I agree with Allison completely that this is a movement that really has no coherent strategy moving forward. Frankly, that has been the case since the last days of June, when every Muslim Brotherhood leader that I've spoken to, that I've heard from, that's spoken publicly on this, said they just did not expect Sisi to actually remove Morsi. They didn't expect it. When it happened, it caught them completely unaware. They thought then that they would occupy Rabaa, that if there was any kind of crackdown, the world would respond. There was a crackdown. The world didn't respond. Many of their top leaders, 13 of 18 guidance office members, are in prison. A handful are abroad trying to manage some sort of international campaign against the regime, trying to put out a media message, maybe trying to take the Egyptian government to some sort of international court, but really no strategy. I want to, though, speak very briefly about what's happening on the ground. In my recent trips, I've increasingly spent less time in Cairo and Giza and gone broadly around the country. And what I'm finding is that while the very top of the Brotherhood's chain of command is not really there, is every now and then able to transmit very broad messages to the rank and file, the local organizations in many places are intact. So if you can just sort of revisualize that pyramid that I put up, the lowest level you have the families, then those are basically 5 to 8 members in Egypt, then the populace known as the Sho'aba, which is roughly 90 people, and then the area, the Muntaka, which could be a couple hundred Muslim brothers. At that level, which is pretty local, those are still intact for the most part, especially, you know, so long as Muslim brothers haven't been arrested en masse, which has been the case. And you know, that is you know, that can have an upside and a downside. For the Brotherhood, the upside is that because muntakas, because those areas can sometimes correspond to parliamentary districts, it does actually give the Brotherhood mobilizing mechanisms at the local level to run in parliamentary elections if they make that strategic choice. And that strategic choice would be easy for someone to project from abroad through the media and through the Brotherhood's Facebook channels. On the other hand, it also is a local mechanism that makes it easy, or not easy, but makes it possible to mobilize small acts of violence and small and increasingly small protests. So what we've seen in the last couple months on the ground is diminishing Brotherhood protests, but organized by these local organizations that, frankly, I don't think are going away. This is still an organization with a few 100,000 members who have gone through that 5 to 8 year indoctrination period, who believe that they should be in power, who believe that something has been stolen from them. And I think that it won't have any relevance for national politics, because it can't really mobilize a national strategy, but at the local level, it can cause some damage.
Yeah, we have an article out by a former member of the Muslim Brotherhood, Ibrahim Hodeibi. I hope you all picked it up when you came in. And in that piece, he talks about the possibility of some members running for parliament in these upcoming elections. I guess there were a few statements to that effect. Is this the path forward for the MB in terms of, you know, making its way back into the political process? Alison, you were going to...
No, I was going to say that's interesting, because that's not the message at all that one's getting from the brothers that I'm speaking to in exile. They're absolutely sort of clear about that fact. There is no return unless it involves Morsi being reinstated. Absolutely none whatsoever. I mean, I think in the long term, yes, it's probably the way back, but if they go back at the moment, the concessions that they're going to have to make in order to do so are going to be so enormous that they're going to damage their credibility, possibly alienate some of their own support base. I think it's just a too risky move for that to happen now.
So they'll sit these elections out completely.
I'm sure, yeah.
Let's open the floor to questions. Let's start with David Mack in the front. Wait, David, for a microphone, and then please introduce yourself, although I've already introduced you.
I'm David Mack from the Middle East Institute, and I'm interested in...
Is your mic on?
Okay, I'm David Mack from the Middle East Institute. You hear me now?
Yeah.
I'm having spent 3 years each in Tunisia and Libya as a diplomat. I'm very interested in the different experiences of Muslim Brothers / Ennahda in the two countries. And it strikes me that electoral democracy is, to a certain extent, a self-reinforcing process. If a party or a movement proves to be adept at grassroots organizing and getting out the vote, then they become more willing to rely upon that as a strategy in the future. Ennahda was relatively successful in Tunisia. The Muslim Brothers failed abysmally in Libya. Alison, particularly given the fact that you've done work on Libya, do you see that as being a lesson for the Muslim Brothers and other similar, in fact, Arab parties and movements in general?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, one of the problems that the Libyan Brotherhood have had, because they were absolutely not tolerated at all under Gaddafi, they never had the chance to do that kind of grassroots activism, social work, welfare work that they were able to do in Egypt. And I mean, they were banned in Tunisia, but they had a kind of presence. In Libya, they had no presence whatsoever. They kind of were parachuted in after the revolution. Didn't do very well in the first elections, although they have, as I said, have been able to somehow dominate the political process, but they haven't been able to win the trust on the ground of the Libyans. And funnily, a lot of them say to me, well, when I'm in Libya, Libyans come to me and they say, we don't like the Muslim Brotherhood, but we like you as an individual, we trust you as an individual. But there's this huge distrust of the Brotherhood as a party, but actually there's a huge distrust of political parties anyway in Libya. So that sort of goes across the board. But yes, I think it is a good lesson to learn how you act, how you work at the local level, how you create those kind of networks and have a base that you have to respond to, which is perhaps why we've seen the Libyans sort of Brotherhood just act in a very sort of, I would say, radical and hawkish fashion. It looks as well as if Libya held general national elections a few weeks ago, and it looks as though the Islamists have been completely trounced in these elections and that the liberals have now come to the fore. The Islamists are now working on the ground to try to derail that whole process. Yes, and again, they don't have that base on the ground to maintain that momentum.
Thank you. Over here on the right. Okay.
Hi, I'm Sam Metz. I'm with the Washington Institute, and I have a Berber question that relates probably to the greater Maghreb. My question is, what do the Berbers think of the Muslim Brotherhood throughout the Maghreb? Why did the Justice and Construction Party in Libya support an Amazigh president? And my third question is, how the Berbers who are usually apprehensive about this sort of thing, how do they feel about the consolidation of power by a transnational organization? Are they suspicious of that? And how does their kind of perspective differ throughout the different contexts?
I guess your question assumes a Berber position. I'm not sure there's such a thing. I mean, there are positions by Berber who have, by people who have Berber background, Amazigh background in one way or another, and it varies considerably from setting to setting. Keep in mind, actually, the appeal of Islamism in many places was not restricted, was not at all. Actually, very often Islamism was a way to bypass the ethnic distinctions to the extent that these ethnic distinctions existed as opposed to tribal ones. Because again, here what we're talking about, when you posit a question in the form of a Berber question, it's very often an urban elite type of question as opposed to the Amazigh-speaking countryside, that where the affiliations or where the identity is more regional and tribal rather than linguistic, with actually many will find a problem with even the bunching with the different, rival groups. Again, without denying the fact that what we have today is an emerging Amazigh nationalism that transcends borders, that spans from Libya all the way to Morocco, and in the case of Morocco has had some institutionalization in the form of a script that is now in place, although, without really an underlying literature to support it, but meaning the idea is that maybe the literature will come accordingly. Nonetheless, that stated, I would say I would avoid a generalization. Indeed, in the case of some Libyan Amazigh organizations, actually they went and sought their Moroccan counterparts to try to see what lessons can be learned from Morocco. In the case of Tunisia, for example, where there's no such thing except for very few small communities in the south, there's no such thing as a Berber question. Nonetheless, the self-identification of the Tunisians is we are Arabs, we are Berbers. It's one and the same kind of meaning. So I would say parse your question more distinctly. And in the case of Libya, it's very often regional, it's very often tribal, that takes on the Berber flag in order to underline the distinctiveness of the particular group.
Can I just respond very briefly to I totally agree. I've never seen a sort of Berber stance on this, and I think in the Libyan case it's only just emerging as an issue now, sort of post-revolution. But you asked why the Justice and Construction Party, the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood's party, voted for a Berber president, Nouri Abu Samain. Nouri Abu Samain might have been Amazigh, but I think that was coincidental almost. He never campaigned on a Berber platform, and there was always a sort of bemusement in Libya at why this issue was picked up on in the West and made such a fuss of. So I really think the Islamists chose Nouri Abu Samain because he was a weak figure who could be manipulated rather than having anything to do with sort of Berber identity or anything like that.
Thank you.
Let me add one point of statistics that was relevant. Just after the fall of the Gaddafi regime, a poll was taken in Libya in order to see what elements of identity come first or second. Libyan came second. Islamic came first. Arab and Berber did not even figure, meaning Arab was something like 5%. Meaning the question was, what do you identify yourself as being first? Muslim, Libyan, Arab, Amazigh. The national dimension, or for that matter, the African dimension that was so dear to Gaddafi, did not even make it into beyond the single digits.
Not a surprise. The lady here in the front.
Hi, Nicole Beitmiller with CSIS. I'm wondering, looking at Ennahda's recent experience in the wake of the new constitution and their failure to get Sharia included, how are other Islamists looking at Ennahda, and what do they plan to do moving forward, moving on key religious issues and facing that kind of the dissatisfaction with the concessions that Ennahda's made?
This is actually an extremely important question because there were intense debates within Ennahda about it. Ennahda will not consider that it has failed to include the Sharia into the constitution. It actually considers that it's got quite a bit of success by the introduction to the constitution and a few references here and there, making actually direct references to an Arabic Islamic heritage and Islamic values or something along those lines. But even Ennahda itself actually had serious discord within it when the whole notion of the constitution including a prohibition on takfir. You see, there were some theatrics all over the place with people fainting for denying what is effectively an Islamic right, meaning as if Islam is under threat. That said, Ennahda has played the role of a hybrid organization, and here hybridity is something that we ought to watch very carefully. It's hybrid in the sense it's trying to ease, presumably, trying to ease people who are now under the Salafist mindset that rejects the legitimacy of Tunisia as Tunisia, the legitimacy of the international order, etc., to ease them back into the national community. Okay, this is the official position. Well, many secularists would tell you no, Ennahda is trying to ease Muslims who are secular into accepting Islamism as an umbrella. Which is it depends on where you stand on the political front. Keep in mind, I remind you of that famous short video segment of Ghannouchi speaking to Salafist leaders and telling them, come down, take it slow, do it gently. Okay, if you read the same, if you take that same video in which he's basically trying to moderate Salafists with the understanding that he's moderating them because he has the arterial motive of Islamizing the state and moving forward, you would be right. The video lends itself to that. And if you take it as he's moderating them in order to pull them into the national consensus or the national community, you can be right. So really it's a question of do you trust or not. So the bottom line, trust is something that is built as a result of watching people in action. So it's important to keep Ennahda under scrutiny to make sure that these tendencies, which I would argue are not mutually exclusive, are not tilted in the direction of not just pulling the Salafist in, but pulling society towards Salafism.
Thank you. Yes, this is the lady in the front here, right?
Thank you. My name is Eliana Sacker. I was very happy to hear about the tribal issues that many people don't understand, that even within the Sunnis, Shiites, Alawites, in addition to those religious differences, there are also tribal differences. I have a couple questions. One, does Qatar give more than just financial support to the Muslim Brotherhood and also Hamas? And also, Secretary Kerry is now on his way to Egypt. How can Sisi deal with an offshoot of Muslim Brotherhood? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Eric, you want to take the financial question? And
sure. You know, in my research on the Brotherhood, both in Egypt and Syria, I found very little evidence that this is an organization that's primarily funded externally. That's not to say that it's impossible, but this is an organization that collects dues from its members. When you reach the level of Muntasib in Egypt, that's when you've already been a member for about 3 years. You start giving 6 to 8% of your income to the organization. Remember, there's an organization of roughly 500,000 people, some of whom are quite wealthy. In Syria, it collects roughly 5% from its members, though it varies, and a heavier burden is placed on the wealthier ones. I think that Qatar's role is primarily in diplomatic support, especially in the last couple of years. That's not to say, by the way, that there aren't, you know, non-Syrian for the Syrian Brotherhood, non-Egyptian for the Egyptian Brotherhood, donors through different organizations, but I have not found any evidence that the states are what back this organization. Really, it's the way that they back it diplomatically. Just as an example, quickly, the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein hosted the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood for many years. Actually, allowed them to establish their own communities. Within those communities, allowed them to establish their own police forces. So long as they cooperated with the Iraqi regime and sometimes used Iraq as a base to try to re-enter and even fight again in Syria during the 1980s. Remember, that happened at the same time that Saddam Hussein was cracking down on the Iraqi Brotherhood in Iraq. So these are organizations that benefit from sort of diplomatic nuances, but don't, from my understanding of them, really get a lot of money from other countries.
And the other question was, how can Sisi deal with Hamas? Was that the, would anybody like to take that question?
No, but can I make a point about Qatar? I mean, the Brotherhood's ties with Qatar go back a very long way. They're not something new. And even before the Arab Spring, whenever I tried to reach figures like Rashida Ghannouchi in London, they were always in Doha. So those ties go back a very long way. My understanding is that Qatar is providing some kind of financial support. I'm hearing that they have been providing money to pay people to go and demonstrate. I have no idea whether that's true or not. But the important thing for Qatar, I think, is that it gives them space for them. It gives them huge media space. Qataris are pumping all sorts of funds into Muslim Brotherhood-owned sort of television stations, news websites in London and elsewhere, and I think that's hugely important. And as well as the diplomatic support that Eric said and that legitimacy. And I think what's interesting now is the Brotherhood has always had an international organisation. That is a very sort of controversial organisation for all sorts of different reasons, and it's never been particularly strong, but it seems to me now that actually Turkey and Qatar have kind of stepped in where that international organisation used to operate, and they're the ones sort of backing the Brotherhood and providing that sort of international cohesion. So I think Qatar is very important in that respect.
If I add a footnote here, it's important to underline the importance of the personal dimension. I mean, it's when we say Qatar, we imagine as if we're talking about state structures and the like. It's really the former foreign minister and to some extent the former prince. The current prince is a little bit confused about what to do with that, with those old commitments. And this is why, for example, what we have today is Al Jazeera has become to a large extent Egypt all the time, meaning it's Muslim Brotherhood Egypt all the time, meaning this is what it does. So it doesn't seem that the current government of Qatar is able to influence that much, so it has decided to compete with itself and to create a new Al Jazeera. So Azmi Bishara now is funded to create what amounts to a whole new media empire that is going to be in direct competition with Al Jazeera to promote a liberal Arab view of matters that would be competing with the Al Jazeera with its Muslim Brotherhood.
But Azmi Bishara has just also opened a website called Al Arabi.
Yeah, this is actually
but this is also a platform for the Brotherhood as well, as far as I can see. So it's all a bit kind of confusing.
In addition to that, it's Qaradawi who really is to a large extent the godfather of the Qatari Muslim Brotherhood partnership. And Qaradawi is, for example, the current boycott of Qatar by the rest of the GCC government, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, but also Bahrain, is to a large extent trying to squeeze Qaradawi out. Will that succeed? It remains to be seen.
Great. We have a question back here in the middle. This gentleman who's got his hand up right next to Natasha. Yes, if you could introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, my name is Hussein Magdi. I'm a researcher in the ECRF based in Egypt. So I want to contest 3 points that Ms. Allison raised. First, on the violence, the threat of the fear from the Upper Brotherhood leadership that they cannot control violence. I think that this is a very well-founded threat, considering that we did get some smuggled footage of very violent and localized and selective violence against the police and the military in the southern suburb of Hulwain, for example, or in the northern suburb in Mataraya, which are based in Cairo. There were also other reports of violence and even a very specific case of castration of a police officer who took part in the alleged rapes. Moreover, in some cities in South Egypt and in Alexandria, the relationship between the Brotherhood and police is managed by common, I'd say, threats. So basically, in the southern cities, the police always release girls they arrest, fearing of retaliation from the Brotherhood. Now, if you link this to what Mr. Trigger raised on how the local formations are still intact, then it's obvious that these acts of violence are not personal, but rather and considering their natures, and they are clearly well planned and well founded and are taken by a decision from the lower leadership. The second point is on the Morsi demand. I don't think, or on the case, at least when it comes to lower leadership, so based on interviewing some of lower leaders and quoting one of a leader of a city northern of Cairo, he specifically said that it's not about Morsi per se, but it's about negotiating from a stronger power position. And also when it came to during the student uprisal, student protests in Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood local leaders were quite willing to drop the Morsi demand in exchange for some support. Finally, on
Thank you very much. I think the main question is the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in fomenting violence, their responsibility, and maybe everybody could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that we have seen some flashpoints. We have seen sort of some outright or individuals committing violent acts, whether those individuals are part of the Brotherhood or not. I think is still rather unclear. But I think we need to remember, as a movement, the Muslim Brotherhood is not espousing violence. It's making a point of really saying, we are a Pacific movement. They know the minute they go down that route, they've lost the moral high ground, they've lost their legitimacy, and they're also at risk of losing their popular support. That doesn't mean that they can necessarily control all these sort of hot-headed youths on the ground. But what I was trying to say was that this great sort of mass uprising that I think the Brotherhood were expecting after the fall of Morsi really hasn't happened. Whether that's because of repression or for other reasons, I don't know. But they were expecting that to happen, and it didn't. And I think that came as a shock to them. They were banking on that as one of their strategies of survival. In terms of this issue of Morsi being the key, that's very interesting what you're saying, because everyone I'm speaking to abroad and in the upper echelons of the leadership, a sort of senior member said to me 2 days ago, Morsi is the key, and we are all united in that, and that's not a point of debate. So maybe we're seeing some differences between inside and outside, which is something interesting to follow.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Eric, would you like to weigh in?
On the violence issue, what we were seeing a couple months ago is young Muslim brothers, and it was verified that they were young Muslim brothers through independent journalism, going on Facebook, creating groups like the Molotov movement, the BAT movement, which, by the way, had a photo of Morsi as Bruce Wayne, which I found offensive as a Christian Bale fan. But seriously, what these groups would do is they would organize and broadcast images of violence done by local groups, burning a general's son's wedding party, burning a police station in Alexandria, showing a picture of a cameraman from CBC that they said was some sort of agent for state security, and saying that he should be targeted. Later on, there was an anti-Sisi page that posted photos of Sisi campaign workers, photos of the children of Sisi campaign workers, addresses of police officers, and I think at least some of this is likely the work of the Brotherhood. Some of it has been confirmed as the work of local Muslim brothers. Whether that's being done with direct command from the top, or whether it's something that local brothers are doing, is very hard to judge. And what has to be said, though, is that the security seems to have gotten a handle of a lot of that. I mean, there were arrests specifically tied to the Molotov movement group. Now, yes, you still have burnings of police headquarters and bombings outside the presidential palace, but we don't know exactly whether that's some young Muslim brothers at the local level, whether that's a jihadi group from Sinai. It's very, very hard. It's very hard to know. But I do think that the fact that there is structural integrity at the local level means that this will always be an option and a possibility. Just on the Morsi point, I agree with Allison in speaking to Brotherhood leaders. Morsi is the issue, but maybe to kind of bring both of your points of view together, sometimes it's not expressed in that way. Sometimes, the issue is not Morsi, the issue is justice. All right, well, what is justice? Well, what we want is the events since June 30th to be investigated, with the killings to be considered murders and the murderers put on trial. Well, what we want is just legitimacy, not Morsi. So Morsi comes back for a half hour and he steps down and calls new elections. So at the end of the day, it is Morsi, right? Morsi, in some vision, is coming back. They're just saying that that's not the goal. But when you kind of dig deep into what it is they're really asking for, it's for Morsi to return and Sisi to die.
I agree. I was also hearing about those sort of the main division seems to be whether Morsi comes back and just stays, or whether Morsi comes back and then appoints a technocratic government or resigns. And that seems to be where the main point of contention is. Yeah.
All right, we're going to take one last question. This gentleman right here with the red shirt, and then we'll wrap things up.
Jim Fippard in the American Tunisian Association. In an electoral situation, people can get swept away by ideology. But after the euphoria is dissipated, they're interested in things that many people around the world are. They're interested in jobs, they're interested in security, fixing the potholes. Is anyone or any group in the groups that you've been talking about this morning starting to think about developing skills in governance as opposed to developing power or or pushing their ideology.
And then also just to wrap up, I mean, we've heard some very strong words here today. The Muslim Brotherhood is irrelevant, weak, losing status, and yet they remain a significant player. Well, they remain a significant factor in the Middle East landscape. So maybe some final thoughts about their future, be it in Syria, Egypt, Libya, etc. So whoever wants to answer Jim's question.
Yes. Yeah, whether the Brotherhood can develop skills in governance, I think that's absolutely crucial to the future of the Brotherhood. And really what the Egyptian experience proved is that the Brotherhood are not politicians. They never learned how to be politicians, and they simply didn't have those skills, and they somehow seem to be out of touch with the reality that they were actually living in whilst they were in power. And I think that's absolutely essential for them moving forward. As far as I can see, no, at the minute, I don't think the Brotherhood has space to even think about things like that at the minute. It's just so caught up with its own survival. I think that's going to be a very long time coming before we see those kind of changes. Having said that, I've seen the Tunisian Nahda leader Abdel Fattah Mourou make some very interesting comments along those lines. So maybe in the Tunisian case, there's a bit more sort of thinking along that way.
Final thoughts on the survival?
Yes, actually, with regard to the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, I would think they were not aware of the fact that they were not ready to rule, and this was part of the reason for their demise. I would say it's far less so in the case of Tunisia. Keep in mind, Tunisia, we always speak in terms of Egypt and in terms of many other countries of the deep state. Tunisia does have a deep state, but it also has a deep society, deep civil society in the form of the labor unions, in the form of a very regional focused network of local interests, Jahawiyya, meaning the idea is that you focus on your provincial interests. And Nahda, being present everywhere, is not immune to that. Along the lines that within Nahda, you had pressure from people who are more in line, at least in terms of interests, in terms of sensitivities with the labor movement, although being critical at times of it, and others who are regional. And therefore, Nahda, even at inception, had the advantage that the Muslim Brotherhood did not have of having that, if you'd like, legacy that it could build upon. It made mistakes, many mistakes, but it also made quite a few successes. And actually, the focus on concrete issues is part and parcel of their platform in a very explicit way today. But I'll go back to saying, because I think you're mentioning me when I mentioned that the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood is irrelevant today on the ground in Syria to a large extent. Actually, I would say to an almost absolute extent, the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood is irrelevant. Maybe in the future, in the mix that will lead to the future being, in my mind, no less than a few years, at least a few years ahead, the Muslim Brotherhood has a role to play, but that will need to be defined in the coming years.
I just want to thank you again for having me, and thank you all for bearing with us. I just want to pick up on a point that Hassan made, which is that the Egyptian Brotherhood was not aware of how unprepared it was for power, and I think that gets back to the structural points that I was making about the Brotherhood, both in Syria and Egypt, which is that this is ultimately an insular vanguard. This is an organization where its members spend so much time around their fellow Muslim brothers who spend so many years being indoctrinated according to the organization's ideology, who are thrown out of the organization, at least in Egypt, if they veer from the commands of their leaders, that they became kind of drunk on their own narrative. And that's why, this kind of organization is very unlikely to succeed in power. And it's frankly why, in my view, no U.S. strategy should bank on their success, because it's probably not going to happen, which is not to say that I anticipated, or that many people anticipated, that the Brotherhood would fall as quickly as it did, but it was certainly a problem. The final point that I want to make is that I think it's important to have some clarity when we look at all of these movements. We should not rush, and I've been happy that no one here did rush to congratulate the Muslim Brotherhood for not being Al-Qaeda. I think that the proper standard of comparison when analyzing the Brotherhood is other totalitarian movements of the 1920s, as Hassan alluded to, which is why these are not likely to be democratic movements, and which is why their emergence in some countries after the Arab Spring doomed whatever democratic processes so many here hope for. So, thank you.
Well, thank you. It was a fascinating overview of the Muslim Brotherhood around the region, its strengths and mainly its weaknesses. There's going to be more to follow in the years to come, but for the moment, please join me in thanking our panelists.